Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 4th chapter in Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, and we just want to review some of the doctrine which is going to be foundational to our understanding. The doctrine that is expressed before what we read comes to make sense of what we read. So, beginning from the 17th to the 31st verse of the first chapter, he kind of expounds on the limitations of worldly knowledge and how he's more content to rely on the foolishness because God uses foolishness to trump the wisdom of the world. And then in the second chapter we read, he kind of evaluates the worldly knowledge is carnal in nature, and so the carnal man can have no thing or appetite or inclination for the things of the Spirit. So those who are wise in the ways of the world often are not wise in the ways of divinity or salvation or anything like that. So it's often a hindrance. Then the third chapter, the tone is really introduced in the 12th verse of the first chapter, where we witness the existence and presence of factions forming around preachers of preference, one of whom was Apollos, and he sort of rebukes their spiritual immaturity by opening it with he's feeding them with milk because they're not ready for the more advanced, the hard teeth chewing stuff, analogous or metaphorical to more advanced doctrines. So he kind of refutes the whole notion of these factions forming around people who were themselves team members. They were members on the same team. They were not competitive personally against themselves. They were all content to use the gifts and services at their disposal to glorify God. So he likens it to he lays the seed and Apollos watered, but Elohim gave the increase. So he personally evangelized. Apollos came through not long then after. He was, we read of his conversion story in the same chapter where Paul personally evangelizes Corinth, and Apollos was an eloquent orator and skilled preacher, an Alexandrian Jew. And they weren't, the important thing is that it was folly to have factions formed around people who were themselves united for the same purpose. Then he kind of reminds them that their bodies are the temple of the Ruach Kadesh. It dwells in you, and that involves certainly ethical obligations and entailments. And then the 19th verse we're going to read, "For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with Elohim, for it has been written, he catches the wise in their craftiness." And again, Yahweh knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are worthless. So one of these is a quotation of Job 5:9, where the thoughts and schemes and conspiracies of the wise, they fall trap into their own nest, essentially. And then he says, "Do not boast in men, for all belong to you." So Paul is very conscious of what he boasts in, and as we read eventually in the Corinthians, he boasts in weaknesses, persecutions, insults, and slights. And the closing verse reads, and you belong to Messiah, and Messiah belongs to Yahweh. So anything we belong to belongs to us. When we belong to the Messiah, we belong to Yahweh, because the Messiah belongs to Yahweh, so too we by connection. Now the opening passage of the chapter we'll be covering is, "Let a man regard us as servants of Messiah and trustees of the secret of Elohim." The us is him and Apollos. He's still addressing the concern. But they considered themselves servants. They weren't celebrities or superstars, even though these sort of people had exalted them to such a status. They were servants above all else. The Greek term used here is an under-rower on a ship. So throughout the Greco-Roman ancient Mediterranean world, there were these galleys on the bottom of which were ships. That's how Paul considered himself. He was not the captain of the ship. He was the under-rower. The captain was Elohim, and he was a trustee. That means a steward or a manager of the revelations that he had been uniquely provided. Paul is privy to a lot of things that prophets and priests of the ancient would have killed to know. "For the rest, it is sought in trustees, that those should be found trustworthy." So the main quality of a trustee or a steward is trustworthiness. They have to be worthy of trust by demonstrating their trust with competent and efficient keeping of their manager's estate, their master's estate. So this is the quality we are to be like-minded as the stewards and keepers of the revelation of grace, which is very much our ministry, even though it was originally given to Paul and the apostles. We are their heirs and their perpetuators. But with me it is a small matter that I should be judged by you or by any man's court, for not even myself I judge. There's nothing personal about Paul saying he will not be judged by any man because he doesn't trust his own judgment. So it's not anyone judging him. He's not averse to that. It's just that he knows how flawed and unreliable human judgment is, perhaps even from looking within. And it was certainly more divine oriented in Paul than most other humans, but he still knew better than to trust on his own reasoning, his own internal resources, his own conscience. He did not consider himself fit to judge every man for every sin, and that was something he was content to leave to Elohim, and he was content that he would be accepted if he were judged and assessed by Elohim on account of his trustworthy trusteeship. For I am not conscious of anything against myself, yet I am not declared right by this, but he who judges me is Yahweh. So there's no human ruling that can give one justification. That's the theological term for being declared innocent at the judgment. So we are all guilty of sin, and we, without the appropriation of the alien righteousness made possible through the atonement and the suffering of the cross, we have no avenue for justification. So the only judgment that really matters is that of Yahweh, and the only one who can protect us from the wrath is Yahshua the Son. So do not judge any at all before the time, until the Master comes, who shall bring to light what is hidden in darkness, and reveal the thoughts of the hearts. And then each one's praise shall come from Elohim. So there's a time and place for everything, but the time and place to judge is not now. That is not to mean that we are to be completely lackadaisical in our interchurch disciplinism. We have to meet the occasion as it reminds, as the situation requires. But the purpose that the Son of Man came into the earth was not to condemn it, but to save it. We're in the business of saving souls, or at least leading them to the one who can save them. We have to attend to the more exalted elements of ministry. And that is not judging. We have to judge sin in our midst if it's going to be a problem and it's going to contaminate the flock. We have to deal with it. But more important is that each one's praise will come from Elohim, so we will have the common assurance of our salvation, and that will be the source of our praise and our gratitude and our grateful expressions. And these, brothers, I have applied in a figure to myself and Apollos for your sake, so that in you might learn not to think beyond what is written, so that none of you be puffed up on behalf of one against the other. So as he likened them earlier to servants and trustees, so they did not exalt themselves at the expense of others, certainly not their master. They gave all the tribute and the glory and the credit and the praise and the power to the one where it belonged, Elohim, who gave the increase. They were happy to water and happy to plant, but they never lost sight of the fact that Elohim gave the increase. These are servant ministers. These are embodiments of the principle. What do we have today? We have a lot of Corinthians. There were celebrity pastors, and they weren't servants, and they were exalted in the ways of the world, and they thought they were mature and spiritual giants, but they are in fact midgets, so they have it all wrong, and Paul's going to tell them why. You are already satisfied. You are already enriched. You have reigned as kings apart from us, and I prefer, indeed, you did reign, that we also might reign with you. So this is a statement of sarcasm, objectively interpreted. They haven't really beheld the treasures of heaven. They are not ruling, and they're not co-reigning with the Creator and the Christ. They're obviously not ruling. The kingdom is, they have not reached this advanced stage of this kingdom that Paul has not, and his path is the way to get it, by apostolic humility, self-debasing, self-degradation, and a spirit of self-sacrifice and not of self-exaltation. For I think that Elohim has exhibited us, the apostles, last as appointed to death, because we became a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. So the spectacle, he was an item of theater to be visibly beheld in the world in which he lived, and his witness was to angels in heaven and men on earth, that the price of being a servant of Yahweh is something that most people should be thankful they're not called to to uphold, because what did Paul? He struggled to eat. He struggled to have shelter. He was a man on the move who accepted no money from his purpose. He was dependent on the charities of others. So he had the right way figured out. He was closer to the kingdom than these so-called super celebrity celebrity servants. Celebrity ministries. We are fools for the sakes of Messiah, but you are wise in Messiah. We are weak, but you are strong. You are in esteem, but we are not appreciated. This is another species of sanctimonious sarcasm, or sanctified sarcasm, rather. So Paul has much to say about the wisdom of divinity being expressed in the foolishness of man, and of course the foolishness, if there was any element of foolishness in divinity, which there isn't, it would trump the wisdom of man 100 times over on its greatest day. So Elohim often delights in using foolish people who look foolish to the world in order to accomplish his wise and perfect design. And he delights when we are weak, and Paul delighted when he was weak because he had the reminder that his grace was sufficient for him throughout the journey. So he had a thorn in his flesh. He prayed 3 times to remove it, and Yahweh told him, I'm not going to remove it, but I'm going to give you this reminder that my grace is sufficient for thee. And, that grace was sufficient to overcome the fact that he was underappreciated and misunderstood and not valued by those who he valued. They were not reciprocating the value that he had in them. Until the present hour, we both hunger and thirst, and we are scantily clad, and beaten, and homeless. So he did not have a home. He was a man on the move. He earned his tent making by trade, but he was ultimately dependent on the charity and the hospitality of others with whom he was acquainted. That's how he moved to and fro. So everywhere he went, he had friends and relationships. But at this moment in time, he was hungry and thirsty because he was journeying from somewhere else, and his clothes were depleted. He was not well clothed, he was not well fed, he was not well rested, he was beaten and homeless, yet he endured, and here he is now with the message for you. And labor working with our own hands. Being cursed, we bless. Being persecuted, we suffer. So Paul, as we previously mentioned, gave professional quality service. That's an understatement, but free of charge. So he earned his trade as a tent maker. This was in the Jewish tradition of rabbiism, where they did not accept sums of money for their services, but earned their livelihood by their trade. And he was reflecting the master teachers: to curse when we bless. We are to bless those who hate us and persecute us, and pray for them. And not only pray for them, but thank them, because without persecution, the furnace of affliction could not refine and make actual Christians. And you suffer when you're persecuted, but if you suffer for his sake and you suffer it all willingly, you enter into the fellowship of suffering, through which he provides the comfort which can enable you to endure all the suffering he has sent your way. Being insulted, we help. We have been made as the filth of the world, dirt wiped off by all until now. So when insulted, the natural man's response is to retaliate with an insult of each other. But Paul has the counterintuitive vision. He says, what's bothering this person? What's wrong with this person? How can I help? So whenever we're insulted, we have to look at what's making them insult us and realize there is a root problem, and we should help them without sinking to their level and perpetuating the fire. And he considered, he had been degraded by the world. The world treated him as dirt wiped off, so that he was less than the bottom of his feet, but he endured it all willingly for the world's sake and for the word's sake. I do not write this to shame you, but to warn you as my beloved children. So his purpose and his mission and his expressive orientation is not to shame, because he paid a higher price than them for the crowns that he claimed, but he wanted to warn them that there is a spirit of worldly wisdom which is in your midst, and it is making me underappreciated and robbing you, more importantly, of spiritual blessings. So if you follow the ways of those who follow the ways of the world, you're going to wind up in the devil's territory. You're going to surrender to the flesh, and your spiritual warfare is over. For if you should have 10,000 instructors in Messiah, yet not many fathers, for in the Messiah, Yahshua, I have brought forth through the good news. This is the only instance in when Paul refers to himself as a father. It is a forbidden term, but the capital letter is used, I believe, in Matthew 23:9. So a father is just someone who acts as a spiritual mentor or as a more spiritually mature position to mold others who walk the same faith. And he's saying, there could be 10,000 of them, but you're not going to meet one that's quite like me. So you're really getting the best and you're treating him like dirt. Therefore, I appeal to you to become imitators of me. The example that ministers provided would have been all the more operationally essential before the writing of the New Testament. So the only image a lot of these people had of the Messiah was that which was reflected, that which radiates in him, which was reflected out of the followers who embodied his essence and carried his word. And there was prophecy, which was more functionally essential. That's when a word from the Spirit hit the speaker to give them the revelation they needed at that moment before the recorded revelation made it not as necessary anymore. For this reason I have sent Timotheus to you, who is my beloved and trustworthy son in the Master, who shall remind you of my ways in Messiah, as I teach everywhere in every assembly. So Timothy was the object of his affection and adoration. He is the recipient of 2 pastoral epistles, which he gives him. Timothy ministered on Ephesus, and he gave them a lot of equipment and resources and advice. And he was trustworthy. This was the character that was found in trustees and stewards. So he was a trustworthy steward or trustee of the same revelation that Paul preached and proclaimed that he had received from Maya, that he taught everywhere to every audience an identical message, no matter what the location. And to Corinthians, he writes, it was Messiah crucified, and that alone. Second verse of the 2nd chapter. Now some are puffed up, as though I am not coming to you. So the existence of pride was poisoning their reception of him, so they thought they could keep on going and being their own petty spiritual dictators, because this Paul, who started it all, wasn't going to be around for them. He has news for them. He does return after writing this letter. He, of course, writes the second letter to epistle, so every controversy and quarrel was not quashed permanently, but they were always there, and he always had a response to them. But I shall come to you shortly, if the Master desires, and I shall know, not the word of those who are puffed up, but the power. So what's on the mind of these people in these assemblies, these naysayers, these critics, these detractors, these usurpers, is going to be of no concern to him. When he comes, he's content to resign that to the Master who directs him. He will bring him there when he needs him to be there. He will tell him the purpose, the Spirit will. And he's not going to be concerned with those who are prideful and boastful, but in the power that had sent him there, the power that he represents. And in this power, no scheming of the worldly, of the wise in the ways of the world could diminish his apostolic authority. For the kingdom of Elohim is not in speech, but in power. Now, a lot of Corinthians, they were cultural sophisticates. They were cultural and cosmopolitan. They put a lot of emphasis on the Greek practice of sophistry, which was the art of polished public speaking, rhetoric, whatever you want to call it. It was just, there was techniques for sophistication and wisdom of words. These are the things precisely that Paul sought to avoid, because he was content with the power in which he preached, and the power was in that name and in his simple message that didn't need elaborate eloquence. What do you want? Shall I come to you with a rod, or in love, or in a spirit of meekness? So his response to the request is going to be determined by the nature of that request. So he is ready to rebuke them with a rod, or love them in a spirit of weakness, but in all meekness rather, and in all ways and in all things provide their example for the Messiah. That means he must exercise the authority he had been delegated as his apostle to intervene and overrule in their personal affairs between them. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.